Croeso and welcome to Voices from the Water, our first Eco-Cinema online event as part of the WOW Film Festival. This is a new initiative and we're absolutely delighted to have you all and our participants. Before I introduce the director and curator, Rowan Aline, just a bit of Zoom housekeeping. So this event is being recorded and it will be up on YouTube. If you can please keep yourself on mute when not speaking, that would be great. So so no background noise is there. Also, if you don't want to appear in the recording, you can mute your video as well. If you need to know about that, you can ask us in the chat box. We're really delighted to have this vast array of speakers from academia, activism, and practicing filmmakers, and we really want this to be participatory, so we really want you to be involved, and there's several ways you can do that. You can either raise your hand in video. For those Zoom acolytes, you can also raise your hand digitally, as it were, if you go to the reactions button at the bottom of your Zoom box, and if you click that, and there's a raise hand tab, you can do that, or you can ask a question in the chat box. You can either do that to everyone, or you can do that directly to myself or Rowan, and we can pick that up if you'd rather not actually speak. Great, so there'll be some short films as part of the presentations. And again, short films and information about our wonderful guests and presenters, we're gonna put links in the Zoom. So for those who like to take notes and scribble furiously, you can relax. We can put the links in the chat box and you can pick that up later. Yeah, and I mean, without further ado, we'll start soon, but we're delighted that Eco-Cinema is the first of a new series of online events for WOW. Having said that though, we had a run in the cinema in Aberystwyth. We've had 3 UK premieres and 2 global premieres in the programme, and just screened for 3 days at the Aberystwyth Arts Centre, which is our home of WOW, Wales One World Film Festivals. So the films will be available online from today for a week. So if you've not seen them, then please catch them. I'll also put the WOW online programme in the chat box. I'm sure you're already aware of that. If there's any questions, any technical issues, then please, yeah, just use the chat box, and hopefully myself, Rowan, or Gaz, the man behind the scene, will get back to you. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Rowan, the curator and co-director of Wales One World Cinema. One World Film.
Thank you, Phil, and welcome everybody. On behalf of WOW Film Festival and Eco-Cinema, this is our Voices from the Water event. It's the first of our Zooms for the Eco-Cinema programme. Clean flowing water is essential to life. Water is everywhere around us and in us. We breathe out water vapour, we drink, wash, exercise and play in water. The water passing through our bodies connects us with global cycles and other bodies of water. Paying attention to this makes us alive to the vast interconnectedness of life. People make a living on the water and risk their lives crossing the water. Our coasts and seas provide food, transport, energy, tourism, exercise, well-being, and a home for a vast array of marine life. Rivers give us drinking water. We fish, swim, and paddle in them. We watch the kingfishers, dragonflies, and otters. But their health and the future of these waters and all the beings that depend on them is in jeopardy, and that's largely down to us. So Voices from the Water is a chance to hear from a diverse range of people whose lives and work can deepen our understanding of water, what water gives us and what we must do to care for it. So first of all, I'd like to welcome our guest speakers. We have quite a few here this afternoon. We have sociologist Charlotte Bates and Kate Moulds from Cardiff University, who with animator Lily May Cross are presenting the premiere of their new short film, The Water Holds Me, The Water Binds Us. We have Laura Owen-Sanderson, founder director of We Swim Wild, who uses adventure activism to highlight issues in the environment. And she's presenting alongside co-founder Christian Dunn, a wetlands scientist from Bangor University, who's also director of the Plastic Research Centre of Wales and the Bangor Wetlands Group. We have David Jones, Stakeholder Director of Simply Blue Group. He's a keen diver, surfer, and he's a charity trustee for Neptune's Army of Rubbish Cleaners, or NARC, who are the UK's first underwater cleanup group. Then we have Mike Christie, Professor of Environmental and Ecological Economics at Aberystwyth University's Business School, whose research focuses on estimating the economic and social value that people attain from nature. And finally, we have Lucy Atala, who is Senior Lecturer in Anthropology at University of Wales Trinity St David's, and her work asks the question, how does water make us human? She's currently part of a team developing a UNESCO-supported project to revitalise water in Colombia alongside the Corgi. So we're going to start the event by giving the speakers a few minutes each to share their films and to talk, share something about some of their work with us before we launch into a bit more of an interactive discussion and questions from the audience. I'm delighted to start that with the film, The Water Holds Me, The Water Binds Us. That's beautiful. So Charlotte, Lily and Kate, would you like to come forward? It was a last minute addition to our programme, but I understand you've just recently finished it.
That's right, Rowan, and thank you so much for fitting us into the panel. It's really lovely to be here, and it was great timing because we had just finished working on the animation when I found out about the festival. And you will have read in the credits at the end there a little bit about the film and what it's based on. But just to introduce the three of us in the project, Kate and I are sociologists. We work at Cardiff University. And for the past year and more, we've been working on a kind of ethnography, a research project, working with swimmers around the UK to share their swims with us and to tell us what swimming means to them. And sometimes we were lucky enough to be able to go and swim with people, but through the pandemic, we also found other ways of working remotely and from afar. And the animation is a way of bringing all those moments that people have shared with us and into something that we can share with the swimming community. So people were sending us photographs and videos and audio notes. People were even painting for us and singing to share their joy of being in the water. And through all these different moments, we were able to explore things like community and the way in which people are kind of bound together by the water, but also the risks that we take in putting ourselves in the water. So we're interested in this project in learning more about how we understand risk and well-being, as well as what swimming means to people and how it becomes a part of their everyday lives. But really, we're here to hopefully open up a bigger discussion about the meaning of water in everyone's lives. And I don't want to spend too much time talking about the project here, but if Kate or Lily have anything they want to quickly add to this introduction before we move on. They're here to answer all your questions. And I know Lily can talk beautifully about the process and what it means to to work together collaboratively and how she approached the project, but maybe we'll come to that a bit later.
I can quickly speak how I kind of went about making the film, if that would be good now. So as Charlotte said, we kind of had this mass of data, these kind of GoPro videos, these photos and voice recordings, lots of just amazing images and videos to work from. So I kind of took that and chose kind of moments that we felt really represented the participants and their experience and our own experiences. And then I hand painted this animation. So it's about 1,500 paintings all put together into this film. We worked with a really amazing sound designer who used recordings from the water and recordings from our participants. And yeah, it's just amazing to share it, 'cause it's been such a lovely project to work on and really special for us all.
Yeah, the whole process has been brilliant, because Charlotte and I were really interested in the kind of multi-sensory world of wild swimming. And, you know, quite often what we have to produce are words that don't, you know, develop those textures and the sounds and, you know, the gentleness and the vulnerability, as well as the kind of bonds. You know, Lily was able to really bring the data alive in a whole different way than we normally do. So the whole process has been so lovely, working with her and producing this film. So yeah, we'll take questions afterwards, I guess.
Thank you, Kate, Lily and Charlotte. I'd just like to point out that the link to the film on Vimeo is available in the chat. So if you'd like to watch it in HD later on, it's also available through the festival platform for the week. So until next Sunday, we're delighted to have it as part of the programme. Thank you very much. We're going to move on next to We Swim Wild, Christian and Laura, and we're going to start again with a film before they speak.
After some big winter storms, we started to notice huge amounts of plastic being thrown up on our local beaches. So we set up Snowdonia Beach Clean to encourage local people to come out and see the issue of the plastic pandemic and what it was doing to our local coastline. We started to think about the bigger issue, so how toxic was this material and how it was polluting our natural environment. Back in 2018, I wanted to track a waterway from the source all the way to the sea. I wanted to raise awareness of the plastic pandemic and the flow of plastic before it enters the ocean. Research had come out in the national press about microplastics being found in a few lakes in the UK. Luckily, the scientist who carried that out was Dr. Christian Dunn, who was actually based at my local university, and he agreed to come on board with that project. So at the time we did the first swim, there was very little research on microplastics. About a month after we completed the swim, it came out that they'd found microplastics in the air on the top of the Alps. So we knew that it was rife and it was possible that we would find it at Snowdon. We now expect to find it pretty much everywhere, but this study is specifically looking at the levels and quantities. We can use that data as a big drive to push the government to start testing for it as an emergent contaminant, because without that data, it's very difficult to prove that point. We hope the government will then act on those results We don't want the microplastic issue to later be a problem like cigarettes and tobacco and asbestos turned out to be like so many decades ago. The water samples that we actually took looked like drinking water. They were really crystal clear. Although you can't see them, they're an invisible contaminant. It doesn't mean that they're not toxic. So after the Source to Sea project on Snowdonia, we decided that we would track all waterways in our most fragile and protected areas. So we're looking specifically at 15 of the UK national parks. But from that data, we'll be able to establish the scale of the problem throughout the water system. At the moment, there is not enough data to establish the full effects of microplastics, so the spread and build-up is causing untold damage on wild waters. There are so many tons of plastic that are currently being released, and they estimate by 2034 that will double again. The scale of the problem is so vast that it needs to be turned off immediately at the source. Our purpose is to achieve cleaner waterways. We want to raise those issues that these contaminants are having on everything from our ecosystems, human health, wildlife, and our waterways.
So after watching that first film, you can see what that's the problem with microplastics that we currently face. At the moment, the UK authorities don't currently test for microplastics as an emergent contaminant like they do for nitrates and phosphates, and that's something that we really want to change. So initially, I started by swimming all the national parks. I think I'm 10 down. When COVID hit, we had to think about another way of collecting all that data, and we drummed up quite a lot of interest in the wild swimming community. So we enlisted the help of there's a few hundred swimmers, and they sent us water samples in from lakes, tarns, all different places, so that we can map microplastics across the UK and their levels. So you can play the film about the waterloggers, which is our volunteer citizen science programme. Please.
So yeah, as you can kind of see in that video, we got fantastic numbers of people collecting water samples for us. But actually, when we get the water samples, that's when the kind of the work in the lab starts. And there's lots of different ways to analyze water for microplastics, these tiny pieces of plastic, which Laura says are pretty much invisible to the naked eye. And a lot of the equipment that you can use to do this are quite expensive and very time consuming. So before kind of the research that we did before we got in touch with Laura, we'd actually kind of developed a new way of doing this, which used really kind of affordable equipment that anybody could really get their hands on. And we did that purposefully because we wanted to eventually these kind of procedures not just be held kind of in a secret kind of universities, but we wanted everybody that was interested to kind of get involved in analyzing them. What we did as well is we had to think of ways that we could get this water to us on an affordable scale, because there wasn't much money at all for this. So one thing that we did, which kind of hit the press at the time because it was quite unusual, is that we worked out that the best bottles that we could possibly use to get water sent to us at Bangor University were wine bottles, screw top wine bottles. And it also gave our volunteers an added incentive to kind of enjoy themselves beforehand, have a nice bottle of wine, or 4 bottles of wine actually, go out, use those bottles to collect our samples and then post them to us at Bangor University. And we've had hundreds sent to us. So our labs do look a little bit like an off license at the present time, but all of those samples are absolutely precious because all of them are helping us add to the picture of microplastics. But it is essential to point out that none of this would have been possible without the passion and the drive of Laura getting these volunteers together.
Thanks, Christian. I think that brings us on quite. So you've got one more thing to add?
Yeah, one more thing. Yeah. So after our passion for wild swimming and looking at the Waterlogger programme, we've decided that to make it more kind of affordable, we're having hubs across the UK. They're called water hubs, where we're having science stations. They're about to launch at the end of October. The first one is in Pembrokeshire, where people can bring their water samples and we can test them live and add them straight to the map digitally. We've also got an education programme in October called Oceans for All, where children across the Welsh coast can get involved. But we're also looking at other silent contaminants, because after my national park swims, if we're talking about Wales particularly, in Pembrokeshire, it highlighted lots of different other issues. So I swam through cow slurry, about 40 metres of that in the Cleddau, which made me quite sick. Then over in Brecon, I swam through like putrid green water, and that was from chicken farming. So there's loads of different issues that this project has brought up, and we'll be looking into that and highlighting that with various campaigns too. So hopefully at the end of this, we'll put a link where you can get involved and help us out. The end.
That's great. Thank you, Laura. Yeah, thank you for highlighting the next stage, as it were, of your work, and I hope people will get involved. I wanted to come on next to David Jones, who is a trustee for NARC and another volunteer-led project looking at cleaning up our water. David, are you showing a film first or speaking first?
Yeah, no, thanks, Rowan. Really appreciate it, and the opportunity to come and talk to you as well. And yeah, if we start off with the film, please, and then I can just rattle through a few slides afterwards. I think that'd be great. Thanks. I'm just going to share a few slides now to supplement that, if that's okay. Hopefully didn't depress you all too much on a sunny Sunday, sorry. Okay, can you see my screen? Have I shared the right screen? Yep, great. Thumbs up and nods. That's fab. So yeah, as I mentioned, it's a volunteer-driven charity that began in 2005. Actually, one of the first underwater cleanup groups in the UK, possibly in the EU. It's great to see a movement that's really got started, and I think you know, as a number of really good ideas. The idea for Neptune's Army of Rubbish Cleaners started in a pub with a local diver, a chap called Dave Kennard, and you know, he dived locally, and he was becoming dismayed at the impacts and the amount of marine litter he was seeing on his dives. So and also the feeling this is, you know, out of sight, out of mind. That green murk in the background is quite typical of a Neptune's Army of Rubbish cleanup dive. It's not the Maldives. It's not really warm, and it's not great visibility. So it really is about giving something back, because if I'm honest, and I do, it's sometimes not that pleasant. And the group's focus is about the immediate impact of making a difference and bringing the litter up and freeing entrapped wildlife, but also more importantly, you could argue, is raising awareness as well, and some of the collaborative solutions that we've been doing over the last years. One of the questions we get asked is what do we find? And that frankly depends on where we dive. Here's just some examples of rivers and estuaries. We can genuinely say that we find everything, including the kitchen sink. That came out of Milford Haven Waterway. One of the divers coming out there. The obligatory shopping trolleys, we've literally found hundreds of those. You know, things that are just absolutely blatantly fly tipped. You know, that people would have had to have driven past the tip actually to go and put all of these in the sea, but they chose to do that. And this was actually one of the shopping trolleys that we were unable to actually take away because a bird had put a nest on top of it, which is really quite interesting. And then if we get out to the open coast and angling ledges, as I say, it really depends on where we dive. This in the top right here, it's an example of Stackpole Quay. I think this dive was. It's where our record is. In one dive, we collected 730 angling weights. Now, I'm not a scientist. I don't know what the impacts of small lead weights would be on the marine environment. You could argue perhaps small, but certainly the angling line does have an impact. We've literally collected kilometres and kilometres of that as well. And also working with local fishers, which is really, really important, and it's a nod to the collaborative solutions. You know, if ghost fishing gear is lost, then we can work with local fishers to try and find that and get that back as well. So we've been doing a lot of that over the years. And just some of the impacts briefly, I'll finish on these. You know, it's obviously the entanglement is one we see quite often. This is a lost lobster pot that had been lost for about a year or so. You can see it's absolutely full of lobsters and crabs. And what happens is if we can't get this back to the surface, then this pot continues to ghost fish where the lobsters and crab then become the bait, and an entanglement with dogfish. And this is something we've seen more often and locally, certainly to Grassholm, where the gannets are now seeing a lot of marine litter and then nets and angling line in their nests as well. So rather than just going to clean it, we've been also looking at education and awareness and just trying to raise people's interest in something that genuinely is out of sight and out of mind. Over the years, it's been amazing to see that change. I think that, you know, the Blue Planet impact has been absolutely fantastic. So that's something that we've really looked to do over the decade or so that we've been doing this. And I'm going to finish on collaborative solutions, because I think this is really important and just an example of when you can work with other stakeholders that are just as passionate as you are about the ocean. We've worked with some angling coaches to create angle tips for Stackpole and Skomer, and that's been really, really helpful. You know, I don't think any anglers want to lose their gear when they come here fishing. They don't know what the seabed looks like, so the tackle tips were about that. And then this is an image of Dave here working with local fishers as well, in terms of just locating lost pots and getting their gear back to them. Thank you.
Thanks, David. I think that's so important, a collaboration and working with people who are working on the water and in the water. Thanks very much for the insight. I'm going to come on to Mike Christie next from Aberystwyth University.
Okay, so I'm hoping you can see my screen okay. Okay, so I'm Mike Christie, and I'm an environmental economist at Aberystwyth University, And I'll talk a little bit about the social and economic value of water and how we can take these valuations and feed it into policy. So some recent headlines. So rivers, lakes and seas, etc. in England, Wales are polluted. And actually they're more polluted if you look at the microbes, etc. in them. So they're more polluted than the public think. I was also involved in a big intergovernmental panel project on biodiversity ecosystem services. And last year it reported that 1 million species are under threat of extinction. And if you look at water species, so 84% of freshwater species and 35% of marine species have declined rapidly in my lifetime. So there's been massive decline in river and ocean biodiversity. So what I want to talk about is the perspective of environmental economics. So what I do is try and look at the benefits people gain from waterways and other natural systems and look at the economic and social value of what's called ecosystem services. So if we can play the video, and I'll come back in a few moments.
This short video introduces the many ways in which rivers contribute to our well-being, including economic activities. But let's first have a look at Earth's water resources. We live on a beautiful blue planet, where 71% of the surface is covered by water. But most of this is in the seas and oceans. Of the 2.5% that is fresh water, less than 1% is accessible. The rest is locked up in glaciers, polar ice, soils, or lies too deep under the Earth's surface to be easily extracted. The freshwater resource is continually renewed in the water or hydrological cycle. Water is evaporated from the seas and oceans and rises into the atmosphere, cools and condenses to form clouds. It falls back to the earth as precipitation in the form of rain or snow. The water makes its way back to the seas through rivers and lakes, as well as underground water. Rivers and streams are an important part of this circulatory system and have been described as its veins and capillaries. Rivers provide a disproportionately high level of direct and indirect contributions to our well-being, including economic activities. These ecosystem services can be divided into 3 groups: provisioning, regulation, and cultural services. Provisioning services are the goods and materials that are consumed or used. These include drinking water and water for domestic, agricultural, and industrial uses, as well as food, for example, fish. Rivers are living systems, and their biodiversity underpins much of the benefits we depend on. Not so obvious are the regulation services, which include cleansing of water by aquatic organisms and local temperature regulation. Rivers also provide a range of non-material benefits known as cultural services. These include recreational angling and kayaking, as well as wildlife viewing and places to bring our families to walk, not only to enjoy the river wildlife, but also the wildlife that lives along its banks. They are also places that inspire art and poetry and refresh our spirits. Unfortunately, many of these benefits and the biodiversity that helps provide them are lost when we allow our rivers to be polluted or damaged in other ways. These include nutrient and sediment pollution from agriculture, discharges of untreated sewage, river drainage and loss of natural bankside vegetation, rivers treated as rubbish dumps. Get to know your local river and spread the word that we need clean, healthy rivers.
So that film was taken from a project I did for the Irish Environment Protection Agency. And what we're doing in that research was to try and demonstrate the causes of pollution, of river water pollution, and different management options to try and protect it, and to try and show the benefits of improving water quality. So rivers contribute in many ways to human well-being, and we've already seen different ways people have benefit from rivers, whether it's swimming, etc. And in an environmental economics viewpoint, we call these benefits ecosystem services, so different ways in which we benefit from rivers. But pollution, whether it's from agriculture, whether it's raw sewage, that is affecting water quality, that is then impacting river biodiversity, and that then is directly or indirectly impacting us. So we saw there's a whole bunch of services, benefits we gain from rivers. So from an environmental economics viewpoint, the problem is that mainstream economics, through economic markets, we think about supply and demand and we decide what we want to do with it. But the problem with that is it often ignores third-party effects. So it ignores pollution, ignores the wider benefits. And I was involved in this big UN project called the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity. And what that does is provide a framework and how we can value those benefits from rivers and express them in a language that decision makers use, so the language of economics. So we can put a monetary value on those benefits. We can compare it directly to agriculture or other uses of rivers. So in this Irish project, we looked at the range of benefits or ecosystem services at 3 rivers, the Moy, Suir and Dotter. So we can see overall, this is kind of summary of the value. So people valued improving wildlife in rivers most, then in water quality and the health of rivers. You may be surprised that angling is quite low, but that was the general public. If you only looked at anglers, and obviously anglers had a much higher. So different people value different elements of rivers. So that was lots of information about the value of rivers in Ireland. And we can then aggregate it up in the affected populations. So if we improve water quality to meet the EU Water Frameworks Directive, then the River Moy is worth about 6 million, similarly with the River Suir. The Dotter, which is a river going into Dublin, then the improvements were worth about 20 million euros per year. And then you can compare those benefits with the cost of actually trying to improve the water quality and try and get that information to governments, to decision makers, to make a case that we need to improve rivers. So that's kind of the economic viewpoint, but there's a whole bunch of other ways in which people benefit from nature and from rivers. And we've seen lots of different ways already in this last half hour or so. So rivers need more than economics. So we also use social culture methods to try and understand the kind of spiritual value of water, or the relationships, how people have relational values with water. So some of the feedback we got from the study in the Dotter near Dublin is the River Dotter is very relaxing. It's a break from the noise. And this person just says they sometimes sit and watch a river, and it's very meditative. Someone else, so for River Suir in Waterford in Southern Ireland, said the river is part of the city. So that river is really important for the whole vibe of the city of Waterford. And finally, again, someone said that having that river made them help to make a decision of where they live. So that river is a huge part of their life. They walk down the riverbank every day. And so it's a really important aspect of their overall life. So if we look at environmental economist viewpoint, what we aim to do is try and make explicit those multiple ways that people value nature or value rivers. And we feed those values into policy, whether through cost-benefit analysis. And some of the research I'm doing currently for the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, what we're looking at is the multiple ways that people value nature and benefit from that. And the results of that study will feed directly in the Convention on Biodiversity. And that will get different governments to think about the economic and social values of rivers and other nature and their ecosystem services. So there.
Thank you, Mike. I think that's so interesting in terms of what you can do as allies, really, and how you can speak on behalf of all of us, I'm sure, and persuade decision makers, policy makers of what we want to see happening, what we want to see changing. So thank you. I'm sure there'll be loads of questions about that later on. I'm going to come on to our final guest speaker, and that's Lucy Atala next.
Hi, thanks, Rowan. So I'm not going to show you any PowerPoints or anything. You're just going to have to listen to me. We were asked to answer a question, and the question was, if water could speak, what would it say? So I'm going to respond to that directly, but also by slightly turning the question around to tell you what it has said to me. And I'm going to do that by telling you a story. So some years ago, I went to Bali because the fieldwork that I was supposed to be doing in Kenya fell through. So I hoped a trip to Bali might provide me with some time to reflect on alternative research directions, how to sort of remedy what was going on. So while I was there, I happened to complete a purification ritual in a sacred pool in a temple, mainly as a touristy thing and also as a fungimational thing for my kid who was with me at the time. And during that ritual, we were told that one could ditch the old to make way for new ideas. So I thought it's very significant. Anyway, that happened. Towards the end of the holiday, after swimming all day on the beach, I went out for a final dip with my child, whose name is Al, and who was about 10 at the time. And we swam out together, you know, sensing the sea change temperature and the color of the sea alter as we sort of moved away from the land. And, you know, it was exhilarating. And at a certain point, I decided it was time for us to return to shore. And I shouted to Al to turn around and come back with me. And it wasn't long before I realized that I wasn't going to get to shore. The sea was restricting me. It was resisting me. It was tugging at me. And while both of us were progressing a bit, it was actually very difficult. And Al, not a strong swimmer, was definitely struggling. And I realized that we were in trouble. The water had altered dramatically from this kind, benign, soft, breathing body to this choppy, slapping, swirling, unpredictable mess that was actually pulling Al away from me. I started gesticulating and shouting towards the shore in the hope of attracting some help. You know, as the water shaped itself up into a series of rapid, dark, dominating 12-foot high waves that pulled us up high and sharply dropped us again. And I felt my legs become heavy and incapable for no real reason. And I was sucked under the water and forced down until I hit something. And that something was a local fisherman who dragged me to shore. And similarly, you'll be pleased to know Al was saved too. Hurrah. Okay, but we were shocked, seriously shocked. We were both shaken by what had happened as we were put down on the beach, and water poured out of both of us. I mean, we vomited water. It poured out of every orifice. You can do a alarmed face at that point, as if it had explored us really intimately. Now, in a similar way to the artist Peter Matthews, who thought water was communicating to him after he was hit by a rogue wave when he was swimming somewhere near Mexico, I also felt that there was a message here for me. Matthews now paints in the sea. And as a result of that experience that he had, the art he produces is a co-production between the water and himself as it splashes on his canvas as he bobs around painting in the ocean. So the waves that I encountered, well, that we encountered, were created by the flow of huge containers that move commodities from Asia to Europe through that relatively tight stretch of water between Indonesia and Australia, I've been provided with my own personal butterfly effect moment where purchases on the other side of the globe affected the very fabric of the water that I was swimming in. It was like I could feel the market's movements, and like my life had become endangered by people who were waiting for their deliveries at home. And the distance between consumer and swimmer, physically miles apart, somehow suddenly reduced, dramatically reduced. So you're all probably thinking, yeah, that's called cause and effect, love. Well, yes, it is, if entities are looked at as separate. It does appear as if things bump into each other, generating changes through a process of cause and effect. Meaning that what happened to me using that framework was just a coincidental byproduct of, several impacting factors, what sort of wrong place, wrong time kind of thing. Or perhaps right place, right time. But you see, that explanation wasn't satisfactory to me. I had been shaken, tumbled by the water, and a message was sort of inscribed almost upon my flesh sensorially. So I returned to the feeling of materials colliding, of body-water collisions, of rising, of falling, of submerging, of puking, all these things. And I realized that despite the force that the water exerted, it hadn't simply done something to me. We had related. And as the water engulfed me, any intellectual notion of space was sort of soaked up by the sense of the water. And I realized that I'd learned a really important lesson about flow and about movements and how movement occupies space, or perhaps more precisely, how they don't actually, how spaces are flows. So I went into looking at how water moves. So my investigations went in that direction. And we all know that the planet has been shaped by water. We see that at the beach, and we see that in many different ways. But water also shapes things by moving inside them. And fascinatingly, as every emerging life form passes through a liquid phase, many of the biological forms that we all know are almost solidified watery swirls. They reflect the swirling movement of water spirals. So water always moves in spirals. It snakes, but it spirals as it snakes. So the architecture, for example, of bony objects like shells or horns or other items that you might see around the world, use that spiral in their designs, as do things like DNA and other microscopic entities, chromosomes, spermatozoa, just like as if the shape of moving water has been hardened into form. And surprisingly, the fleshy materials that make up your body follow similar patterns. So the human heart is essentially formed as an elongated spiral twisted around itself, which not only mirrors water's method of movement, but also supports your blood to move effectively. And brains are similarly constructed. So in addition to the spiraling forms of muscles and bones and shells, we see the architect of water rushing through our world. And as Schwenk says, bone has raised a monument in stone to the flowing movement from which it originates. So Schwenk, a German researcher, also says it appears that the liquid has expressed itself in the body, in our bones. And so the movement described by watery flows are evident in every fabric of matter. So not only does water take shape as it comes into cups and so on, but it also shapes and acts on other materials. And so bodies and other vessels echo that watery pattern. So water has designed the world, and as the climate changes, which essentially means water is going to change its behaviors, it may take back some of that control and redesign it again in association with the changes that we have wrought upon it. So what I'd like to do is help redesign the world using this knowledge so that water can flow as it needs to, instead of being forced through pipes, dammed up, contained and held. Water needs to keep moving. Oh, I could go on, but I've probably got to time, haven't I? I have, yeah. Okay, I'll shut up.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lucy. I actually could listen to you for hours and hours, I think. And I think that demonstrates the power of storytelling for getting these ideas across. So it's really, really important to hear. So I'd like to, if we can have all the speakers spotlight again, Gaz, then what I'd like to do next is to ask the speakers first, before we come to questions from the audience, what questions do you have for each other, or what observations or reflections on listening to each other just now have come to your mind? Are there areas of commonality or difference? We'll come to Mike had his hand raised.
So there must be something about Bali. About 10 years ago, I was giving a keynote speech to a conference in Bali, and it was actually about a study I did in the Caribbean about the benefits of coral reefs. And we're talking about the fishing, the coastal protection, the tourism benefits of the coral reefs. But the day before my keynote speech, I was out surfing with some French guys, and I wiped out in the surf reef and kind of gashed my head open. I needed 6 stitches in my head. So the next day at this keynote speech, I was like talking about the benefits of coral reefs, and I had a kind of baseball cap on. At the end of my talk, I said, well, I actually found out yesterday the disbenefits of coral reefs compared to a nice sandy beach. And I kind of took my baseball cap off with a picture of all these stitches in my head. And I said that this benefit is $40 because that's how much it cost me for those stitches. So it must be something about Bali and water gets you.
I would completely agree with you, Mike. Bali is extraordinary in terms of water. I mean, I could have said so much more about the direction that water has actually taken me. After having been in a sacred pool and then nearly killed by it, you know, I've now spent years looking at it. So Bali is, yeah, interesting, definitely interesting. Can I ask a question? Right, yeah. This is to We Swim Wild, so Christian and Laura, I think it is. Have you come across, so I've come across work that talks about how water can't move in the same way that it used to because of the amount of plastics in it. Have you come across work like that?
Yeah, when it comes to kind of pollution, then you're starting talking about macroplastics, so not the microplastics which we're looking at, but it can be a huge issue, especially when you have storm drains and places like that, because then you have kind of literally kind of grids, and if that kind of gets blocked up, as it always does with kind of vegetation and things like this, but when you have kind of these big sheets of plastic, potentially from kind of agricultural waste and all sorts of waste, and when that starts to block up, then it can cause, I mean, serious problems, massive problems. But we could then start kind of broadening this out a little bit into what we've kind of done with our rivers over time and canalizing them and not allowing them to meander more like that as well. So it's just perhaps another way that we are perhaps not treating our waterways as we should do, and now it is starting to bite us on the rear a little bit.
I was going to say, in terms of the animation that we saw, because Christian and I are like yin and yang, because he's really science logistics and I'm probably a bit more hippie. So together we sort of balance each other out. But people ask me, like, why do you swim through? I've swum through sewage not purposely, you're just in it and you can't get out. Sewage overflows and all sorts. And I think that the animation that we saw was really beautiful, because it's difficult to explain to people that you have you kind of fall in love with the water. And that's why we do what we do. I guess it's similar to what NARC do, because they go to some really dodgy places. I'll spin that over to Dave. But it's because you've got such an affinity with the water, I imagine.
Yeah, so some of the research that I've looked at is actually about detergents and microplastics, and says that water can't move in the same way that it used to because of the amount of detergent in there. It changes its ability to meander. In fact, it travels in straight lines, which makes it more likely to flood. I don't know, it might be something you want to look into.
Write that down.
Sorry, yeah, no, it does as well. Yeah, and also, I mean, when we started talking about things like that, then you started talking about pharmaceutical waste, and it's probably microplastics, plastics in general are kind of quite popular, quite sexy when it comes on to kind of water quality, and even kind of the more kind of hardcore pollutants, or kind of more obvious pollutants, which we've kind of been aware of, like nitrates and phosphates. You know, when you see these algal blooms, and when you kind of see these dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico and places like this, it's very kind of, we kind of are aware of this, you know, and we know more or less what we need to do about it. But when it comes to things, exactly as you said, detergents, but also pharmaceutical waste in general, it's almost a little bit been brushed under the carpet. There have been some research done on it previously, but really we have absolutely no idea about some of the pharmaceutical waste that is entering our waters on a increasing level as well. And don't get me wrong, you know, some of these fantastic drug developments which we have saved lives, phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. However, we never really do we don't really do intensive and long-term environmental analysis of those drugs and what happens when they get into our waterways. And it's perhaps an area which is going to rear its head over the coming years, because it has been brushed under the carpet, out of sight, out of mind. And let's face it, you can't see them, and you can't see the kind of the green algal blooms which you get with other pollutants.
Thanks, Christian. Mike's had his hand raised.
So what I think Charlotte said about yin and yang between artists and scientists. So I had a project called Cross Pollination, where we work with a bunch of scientists and a bunch of artists. And as you can say, it's very hard to relate to it. But when you get together, artists can do just amazing things to articulate the science, to make a science meaningful to people. So I think it's something that's really worth trying to do, get the academics and the artists together, and magic happens. It takes a lot of work getting it to happen initially. And you're just like saying there, God, these artists, they never plan things, they just make things happen by themselves. But after a while, you get to work together, and I'm sure you guys have seen the same. What you can produce is really inspiring, and producing stuff I could never even think about. So I do recommend getting artists and scientists together, really good combinations.
I was wondering if I could bring Charlotte, Kate and Lily in on that, and maybe you could talk a bit more about your experience of making the film.
Sure, thank you. Shall we all unmute ourselves together and have a conversation? I think Kate said at the beginning that, you know, it was, for us, it was really about not reducing everything back to words, that we were having all these beautiful moments shared with us and we didn't just want to write about them. And so I was really, really lucky to find Lily, who is a swimmer as well as an illustrator and animator, and brought her own affinity and relationship with the water to the project. And it's just been a beautiful thing for us to work on, and a different way of sharing our work with a different audience. Do you want to say something more about working on the project, Lily?
Yeah, I think it's been so interesting for me kind of taking this academic research and taking Kate's and Charlotte's writing, which is incredible and in depth, and kind of trying to understand the sensory and tactile aspects from that and translating that into something that, you know, people can communicate with and connect to, maybe a bit in a different way, not in a deeper way or a quicker way, but in a different kind of more physical way, maybe, like having the sounds and the colors and the texture of water and being able to be immersed in that. And I think for our project, what was really exciting was we had this footage from the perspective of swimmers, and these, you know, GoPros strapped to their chest, so you were really in the water with them, and kind of being able to translate that into this film and take you on this journey through different waters throughout the UK with different groups of people. I think that was so exciting for me, and yeah, just kind of being able to translate this huge amount of research, which they painstakingly did, into paintings and films. Yeah, has been so exciting.
Yeah, I mean, I guess part of the thing that we're always trying to do as ethnographers and sociologists is to kind of, you know, make sense of the worlds of our participants from their perspectives. And, you know, as Lily alluded to, we had all this kind of multi-sensory, really rich data. And the film really was able to kind of create a compelling and coherent narrative out of these disparate voices, but really bring out the kind of core meaning and the things that we really wanted to say about the water. So yeah, it's been lovely.
Thanks, Kate. Do any of the other speakers have any questions for each other before we take questions from the audience or reflections to give? Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Phil, who's been keeping an eye on questions coming in from the chat and from the floor.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for those amazing presentations, and very visual as well. It really made me think a lot of what Mike was saying, of making things explicit and you know, education and storytelling and combining that. So I think you've all done that wonderfully, and Lucy, your story was very captivating, so thank you so much for sharing. One question we had, which may be more, well, I guess it's for the scientists in the room. I like that idea of yin and yang, but maybe it's for the We Swim Wild crew and Mike as well. It's a question from Beck, which was, if the microplastics are getting into upland waters, are they airborne? Who would like to answer that, if there is an answer there?
Yeah, I can answer that. Yes, they are. It's dead straightforward. Microplastics have been found to be in the air and in the raindrops as well. So yeah, they're in the air. In actual fact, if you take a good deep breath now, you've almost certainly inhaled some microplastics. They're kind of falling all the time on our food as well. So it's estimated as well that through various mechanisms, including kind of building up in the food chain, we consume about a credit card sized piece of plastic every single week, which is quite an extraordinary amount of plastic. It's in everything that we consume basically, and breathing in, you got microplastics. It's crazy when you start thinking about it. And without kind of alarming people though, I would state that we don't know if this is having any negative effects on human bodies. We don't yet know the full negative effects it's having on habitats, on other organisms. We don't yet know. The evidence is coming out that it can be having an effect on various things, from soil health to all sorts of things. But there is no smoking gun, and so we shouldn't be starting to panic. But as Laura says in her talk, in her video, what we can't afford, or we hope is not the case, is that plastic turns out to be like the 21st century version of lead or tobacco, and it does actually have all these effects, which will only become apparent in the next few years, because don't forget, plastic is such a recent human-made product.
Thank you, Christian. You've given me license for my eco-anxiety, I think. I think that's both a good and a bad thing, going back to the yin and yang. Do Laura or Mike want to add anything to that, or shall we move on to another question?
I get all my lines from Christian, so no.
Great, okay. So yeah, I would like to bring someone in, some from the audience, Gwenda, who I think might have something to say about the plastosphere. Okay, Gwenda, over to you.
Hi, I mean, it's fantastic having these films, because I think we've really got to encourage our connection with water, and yeah, it's just, you know, it can only be good. I live on a beach, and I actually collect things on a daily basis, but on a monthly basis, I paint what I find. And one of the things I found increasingly is wet wipes that have clearly been out in the ocean for a long time because they're covered in a sort of hydra. And, you know, what I'm imagining is that there's whole islands of wet wipes out there that come in occasionally. And this sort of led me to talking to the water authorities, because of course the only place these wet wipes could be coming is down the river. And of course then I realized that we actually have combined sewers everywhere. We don't have just sewers coming from houses straight to the sewage treatment. The sewers and the rainwater are all connected. And then I started looking at the data from Welsh Water Authority, and actually they're one of the only water authorities who really do publish this data, and realized that 2,000 hours, the water's just being released straight into the River Teifi because of the amount of storms. Now, I calculate that to be about a third of the year, which makes me think that actually sewage treatment works are not really operating. And it's very, well, it's actually quite crazy that we're imagining that when we poo in the toilet, it's actually being treated. And it just strikes me that, you know, we've got everything totally about face, and that we should be listening to some of the people who were campaigning back in the 1800s, saying that, you know, exactly this type of thing was going to be happening, that, you know, we cannot actually just keep on using water toilets, and that we've got to start really thinking seriously about bringing in a night soil industry and making sure that, you know, I mean, why don't we go back to that Victorian idea of having everybody having their ensuite with their commode, and having collections, and actually putting that on the land, and that enters that beautiful system as Lucy described. The water's just traveling through the soils. You know, it's the soil is actually a watery environment, and so it would be, you know, quite a wonderful thing if we started to, I suppose, use these natural products. They may be our waste, but they're all our, you know, our actual waste products that are part of this cycle of life. Absolutely. And keep our rivers clean.
Absolutely.
Anyway.
Oh, thank you very much, Gwenda. Yeah, that's very interesting insight, and very thoughtful as well. And I guess it speaks to what everyone has said, the fact that, you know, we are just basically different bodies of water. Perhaps, you know, we've got it wrong calling it planet Earth. Maybe we should be calling it planet Sea or Thalassa or something, because we are all watery beings. So I think that's a really, really good point, and it speaks to a lot, I'm sure, many in our audience who are ecologically minded and aware. I have another question from Camilla Saunders. Are there any academic groups out there who will support local communities in Wales in testing the water quality of the rivers? I suppose that's again for, yeah, oh, there's Laura's hand, yeah.
That's what we're about to launch with the Water Hub. So doing a pilot project in Pembrokeshire and Snowdonia. So basically you can come to that hub, which we'll announce. You can check out our website and social media, and everyone can bring their water samples there, and that'll be tested for microplastics and other contaminants like nitrates and phosphates, so we can see a bigger picture. If that works, Christian's designed a plan, or we have regional hubs across the UK, so that, like for example, just the study that we did was quite laborious, that people had to send in samples, it takes a long time. It's not great to ship all the water over, etc., etc. So yes, we're just starting the pilot at the end of October, and hopefully we'll see that pan out, but that is in Wales specifically, the pilot project.
Fantastic, thank you, Laura. That's really interesting to hear. And I think, yeah, Camilla said she's in Powys, and saying that they have a huge problem with industrial farming. And I think someone else was asking earlier, Ali, who's in Pontypridd, if the waterloggers in that area, do they need any more wine bottles? So I'm sure, Ali, if you get in touch with We Swim Wild, I'm sure there's a network there, and I'm sure that's a great way of recycling. Yeah, I'm just reading another question that's just come in from Simon Whitehead. Understanding that the reality of plastics, is kind of an existential question as much as anything. They exist, it exists, it's in us. Yeah, maybe I think what Simon's asking is about any proposals around legislation at a kind of governmental level, because as we heard earlier from the speakers and in that very powerful video from Source to Sea, it begins on land and then ends up in the water. So does anyone know of any kind of legislation work happening or occurring? I think Lucy has her hand up.
Thanks. I don't want to, in fact, I can't talk about policy or legislation, but I do want to respond to that if that's possible. So, clearly we're in trouble, and we have been in trouble for a while, and we're heading towards more trouble and more turbulence. While everybody's doing fantastic and wonderful work in all the different ways that they are here, and this has been really interesting to watch, I think, and hear about, I think something that Donna Haraway says is important to hold on to. So she urges us to, quoting the title of her book, stay with the trouble, and to make kin of those things that we now think are objects that we use. And I class water as one of those things that is not an object or a thing, but is something that people imagine they have to use, and they require it for their lives, rather than it exists as part of the everything that is creating the world that we all live in. So when she says make kin those things, I think she's talking about loving relationships. And when you love someone, you don't want to use them or change them. And you don't think about what they can give you. What you do is you urge towards them. You want to know them deeply. You get pleasure from giving to them, and you support them to flourish. And that's how we have to approach water. In fact, that's how we have to approach everything. But as we're talking about water, that's water. So it's about changing the way you see the world. So instead of the world being something for you to use and to profit from, it's something that you're part of, that is part of you, that cycles through you. And that's the mindset that needs to happen. Instead of thinking, what policy, how can we boss people around, what can we do? All of that's great, obviously not my interested area. But I think if we come to the world with that mindset, we wouldn't have got here.
Yes. Thank you very much, Lucy. That's beautifully put. And it's great to hear the name Donna Haraway, and maybe we can bring in Bruce Lee and his famous quip of being like water. I think we can befriend it in that way. I see that we've got Christian and David who want to ask questions. We'll start with Christian, seeing as he had his digital hand up first.
Oh, yeah, no, just to respond to Simon's about the terror inside of plastics, and it's really important that we must remember that plastic is a fantastic product. It has saved countless lives, and I wouldn't want to live in a world without it. But it's a resource, and like all resources, we shouldn't waste it, and we should use it wisely. And the problem is that we've been wasting it. When it comes to legislation as well, the government or the UK government and the Welsh government and the Scottish government are bringing legislation to stop using certain items of plastic. You could argue that this is too little, too late. Fair enough, but they are starting to, and there is a section in the Environment Bill as well to limit the amount of single-use plastic packaging as well. So the governments are moving, but perhaps we need legislation clearly, but I would suggest that what is even more perhaps exciting and kind of refreshing is that big businesses are actually making changes as well. They're the guys that are now saying that they're going to stop doing things. You know, Iceland said they're going to stop it first, but also really this is coming from the ground up. People themselves, consumers, we are starting to change. You know, Amazon is having to think about how it is sending its packaging out because so many of us complained about it. We are making a difference. So yeah, that's just a response.
Thank you, Christian. Yeah, I often wonder what future humans will think of us. Instead of finding oil, they'll find CDs, which might not be that useful. Anyway, David.
It was just to respond to Simon's point, and I don't know the Canadian academic Heather Davis, but look, I think lobbying is something we can all do. Quite frankly, it's really simple. We've all got an MP and we've all got an MS if we live in Wales, and both. So, you know, we get asked quite a lot about how we can help NARC, and I appreciate that not everyone can go diving and current in the Water Olympics, but we can all write to MPs and keep all of this high on the political agenda, because I appreciate that consumers can obviously change the way businesses do business as well, but I think policy and politics is really important.
Absolutely, and I think that's a very valid point. I mean, we have agency, but we're also part of the demos. We're part of a system, and we are the system. So I think it's a mixture. Again, maybe using that kind of Bruce Lee analogy, that Eastern analogy, the yin and yang, which Laura and Christian are bringing so beautifully. Oh, David, did you want to say something else, or was that an accidental hand up?
It was a legacy hand, Phil.
A ghost hand. Okay, Zoom phenomenon. Okay, do we have any other questions? Maybe anyone who wants to speak in person, or if there's any more questions in the chat box, this is your time to engage with us, with WOW, and with our fantastic panelists. I mean, I think I've got a general comment or observation I would like to make. I think Mike had made it, and it was really interesting to see that everyone had films. And I guess this is maybe specifically to the team that made The Water That Binds Us in Charlotte, and just making, you know, storytelling and education and the importance of that. And as academics, how have you felt that storytelling has magnified and amplified, I guess, your work? Maybe Charlotte and Kate and Charlotte.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, for us, it's just the most powerful way of sharing work is to tell a story. And I think Lucy recognised that too in the way that she told us all her story and drew us all in today. You know, I don't want to write writing that's hard to read or that people aren't going to enjoy. We write and we make things like this film as a way of drawing people in and of engaging them and of encouraging people to feel as well as to think in everything we do. But an opportunity to do a project like this is just so much more of that than we can do with words.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think Laura talked about, you know, that attachment, and a phrase that Charlotte wrote that I love about swimmers, that they have this stubborn attachment to water. And I think that idea of telling stories that are emotive and bring to life the sort of the textures and the attachments and the bonds that people have between each other around the edges of the water and the communities that we researched, but also to the water, you know, is really important. And I guess, you know, listening to the sort of idea that there's yin and yang of science and art, you know, I would say that there's a whole range of other ways as well that we can enroll people in knowing that we can tell stories about the world that make sense to people in different ways and drawing on different registers of knowledge. And I guess that's something that we've really tried to do, to tell these, you know, these stories of the strength of bonds, stories of vulnerability and strength, stories of kind of embodied ways of being in the water that do then sort of point us to these kind of ethical commitments that we're all talking about in relation to different waters. So yeah, I think, you know, for us, it's important to tell those stories in different sort of textured ways. Sorry, my kids in the background. They're trying to stay out of this room, but failing. They're adding some texture to the story I'm telling right now. Yeah, so that's all I wanted to say.
Oh, that's beautiful, Kate and Charlotte. I love that, and this idea of sound and texture, especially in your short film, and the idea of thinking and feeling. So thank you very much. Rowan, you've had your hand up, sorry.
So it's 25 minutes past 5 almost, and we have another event at 6, which is very much about the cultural side of water and waters in Wales. And so I'd like to be able to invite you all onto that, but I'm sure you all need a cup of tea and maybe a wee before, so we'll be taking a break shortly. I'd like to thank all of our speakers and the audience for getting involved in this event and turning up today. We've heard so much about the way that water shapes us and what we need to do to care for our water systems. And I think whether you're a swimmer, a diver, or you just drink and breathe water, we all have different ways in which we relate to water, and in a sensory and embodied way. I think we've also heard how we can speak up more on behalf of water. And just to sum up before we say goodbye, I'd like to ask the speakers again just to recommend one action that we can all take in order to care for the world's waters in a better way. What would that be? One action. Who's got their hands raised? Oh, Mike.
So I think we appreciate water in many different ways, whether it's for economic benefit, whether it's for spirituality from wild swimming. And I think it's just important that we let policymakers, decision makers, big supermarkets, etc., understand that we appreciate good quality water. It's important for our life, and lobby the various people to keep increasing the standards of water quality from a whole bunch of different perspectives, and saying we care about it as a public, so make sure policies reflect that.
I would probably, just go along with Mike, Rowan, in terms of public policy and politicians and keeping it high on the political agenda. We've seen what Social Push can do over the last 3 or 4 or 5 years. It's really, really powerful. So we've got to keep doing that.
I'd also say on the back of that, just keep using the waters. I know there's been a huge, over coronavirus, lots of people started using the outdoors more and more, and swimming and surfing and all sorts. Keep doing that, and then you'll keep seeing the changes in the water and what's happening on the ground, and you can use that to help kind of clean up our waterways.
I would say pay attention. Pay attention to water and change your mind about how you think about what it is.
I'd say, obviously, this is looking after our waters is a huge national, international issue. But I would say take responsibility, individual responsibility, and whether it is lobbying someone or whether it's just stopping using some single-use plastic item, which you kind of got used to using, is all going to help. Fundamentally, all down somewhere down the line, it's going to help our waters. So take individual action.
I think what Lucy just said reminded me of Mary Oliver's poem, where I think she says something like, I don't know exactly what a prayer is, but I do know how to pay attention. And I think this kind of thing of, if we don't know exactly what to do, you can start by really looking and, feeling the water. If there's a river on your way to work or whatever it is, kind of spending time with that and looking at the colours, kind of talking to people and seeing their experience of the water. I think, if we can connect with it more, we can see how we can help it.
Okay, thank you everyone. Before we finally go, I just want to respond to a question that Avi had in the chat, which is just wondering why there are no Black voices in this discussion. Not good enough, whitewatering it. And I completely agree. I wouldn't say that was an oversight on my part, because originally it was definitely the intention for this programme to have representation, and it didn't come through there was another film actually that we were going to have in the programme, and the events that were attached to that, because the film got pulled, fell through as well. So personal apology from that, and I definitely acknowledge that that's something that I would like to do better in the future, and I hope that I will be able to announce further events that do represent Black and minority ethnic communities and their relationships with water too. Lucy has her hand raised.
I'd just like to say that I might look white, but I'm not white. I'm Lebanese. Abdallah is my surname, so I'm here. Don't judge a book by its cover.
Thank you, Lucy.
Okay.
Again, my apologies for that as well. Yes, also on that, I'd like to say that within the film programme, we do have a very strong piece of advocacy from the Yanomami people in Brazil, and that's a film called The Last Forest. Of course, that's the Amazon rainforest, and in their own way, they communicate a lot about the relationship with water and what's happening in the Amazon with gold prospecting and the poisoning of the rivers with mercury. I do recommend you watch it. It's available in the film programme this week. So thank you, everybody. I've really enjoyed the event. I wish that I could have given each of the speakers so much more time. I hope that we'll be able to have you back for future programmes as well. So thank you, everybody. And see Chwedl Dŵr, the Fairy Tale of Water, which starts at 6 o'clock. There'll be a separate Zoom link for that. It's with Peter Stevenson and Jake Whitaker, who are presenting actually the global premiere of their new film. It's about 40 minutes long. There'll be a Q&A discussion alongside that as well. It's all about many different issues to do with water, mythology, fairy tales, folk tales, stories, newer stories attached to sort of industrialisation of water systems within Wales as well. It's going to be another fascinating event about water culture. So thank you very much, everybody, and hopefully see some of you at 6 o'clock.